Okay, so good morning. My name is Robert Stein. I'm the Deputy Director at the Dallas Museum of Art, and I'm really pleased to be with you this morning. Corinne asked me to come and talk to you about the theme of opportunity, and one of the things that I realized is that opportunity is really the reason why I have ended up here in museums. I don't come from an art background or a museum background, but rather from a technology background, as is evidenced by a skewed slide, apparently. So it's a good thing I'm in museums. But the reason I'm here is that I believed that museums could really change the world. It was something that to me seemed a little naive when I made a switch about a decade ago, but as I've worked more and more here, I think it's very true. And so this morning I was very pleased to be able to come and talk to you a little bit and imagine what the world might be like in 2030 or in 2050. For those of you who the 1980s are very familiar, 2050 is exactly the same distance from 1980. So it's not that far away. I know. So one of the things that occurred to me is that we're doing a bit of telling the future. So take this with a grain of salt, but reading the tea leaves seemed to be an adequate metaphor for what we're attempting to do. For any of you that know a little bit about the history of tea, tea has been the center of culture and cultural exchange, community and relationship building, religion, art, architecture, for centuries. And so it seemed like an apt metaphor to think about the place of museums as a similar sort of role. And it was immediately obvious to me that as the world continues to evolve and at the same time get closer together, that global issues that affect the world are in fact affecting our global museums. So let's look out ahead a little bit and try to think of what are some of the trends that we're seeing that will come into play for us, if not now, then in 2030 or 2050. It's clear that the globe is changing very quickly, and among that, I think one of the most pressing issues that we'll have to deal with as a society is a population change. We've all followed the statistics about global population. We are growing at a rate of about 80 million people added to the planet each year. Do we have any Germans in the crowd? No Germans? Germans, Jens is a German. Okay, so that's about the population of Germany each year. This is a growth curve that shows the bars is the amount of population that we're adding to the planet, and the red is the world's total population. So we're currently at about 7.2 billion people. We're cresting towards 9 billion in 2050. So what will this place be like at 9 billion people? We're seeing an influx and a collection of those 9 billion people into cities. There's a number of reasons for this. Climate change and energy, but as well as the global connections between cultures are driving those citizens to live in cities. By 2050, 70% of us will live in a city of 1 million people or more. What that means is that between today and 2050, a city of 1 million people will be built new and fresh each week in order to reach this by 2050. So what does that look like when we get there, and what happens to culture and society? An author named Adam Greenfeld writes about smart cities, and I can't say that he's necessarily a fan of smart cities, but he recognizes something about the quality of people who live in cities. And he says that negotiating the circumstances of everyday life in any true city tends, over time, to create broad-minded, feisty, opinionated personality types we'd have no problem recognizing wherever and whenever it appears in human history. City people may well be tolerant of diversity, not out of any personal commitment to utopian politics, but because that's just what the daily necessity of living cheek by jowl with people who are different than you imposes upon you. So this is a great attribute of cities, but it's sort of naive to think that that sort of cheek-by-jowl living comes without some difficulty and sacrifice. What happens, in fact, is we see a growing disparity in the distribution of wealth. We know that 1% of the world's population owns 46% of the wealth, and that 85 of the richest humans on the planet own as much wealth as the poorest 50%. So this disparity is one that we'll have to deal with, and as we come into closer proximity with each other, those relational, cultural collisions are going to become more and more critical and important to us. At the same time, this may seem a little disconnected, but it's really one and the same. I would assume that as our population coalesces around cities, that we would see the growth of the internet continuing to grow with it. But when I studied this, I was actually a little bit surprised. I started looking for statistics that talked about the growth of the internet. And what I really found is that the growth of the internet is slowing. So this is a chart from Kleiner Perkins that shows the growth of the internet from 1996 to 2013. The blue bars show the total number of global internet users, which is about 2.6 billion people out of 7.2. So those of us in the room represent among only 40% of the world's population that even has access to the internet. And that global internet access is actually slowing down, not growing. So as this pace continues, you have to ask, where is it going? One of the things that we're seeing is that in areas where the internet is still growing quickly, it is largely connected to wealth and the growth of wealth, whereas population growth is not necessarily linked in the same way. So what we have to be careful here is that we're creating a gap, and that this lack in access to internet and access to wealth is creating a disparity between the haves and have-nots. So what happens when these cultures collide together, and what role can museums bring into equaling this out? I think for a long time, museums have acted as sort of our modern-day cathedral, a secular cathedral where we're working out various differences in our culture. In fact, Michael Kimmelman wrote a great article for the New York Times in 2001 called "Museums in a Quandary, Where Are the Ideals?" He says, museums have become cathedrals for a secular culture, storehouses of collective values and diverse histories, places where increasingly we seem to want to spend our free time and thrash out the big issues. We put our faith in a few traditional institutions these days, but museums are still one of them. So I love this idea that museums have the opportunity to be the place where communities that are different than each other, that come from a different background, that have a diversity of culture, of wealth, of education, can interact on the same place and thrash out those big ideas together. As we see the polarization of politics, the income disparity that we talked about, access to information, museums remain a place where, on equal footing, we can meet with people who are different than us. There's a study in the US by Americans for the Arts called Animating Democracy that advocates for a place for museums in the role of civic discourse. And they highlight that the potential of art to create indelible images, to express difficult ideas through metaphor, and to communicate beyond the limits of language makes it a powerful force for illuminating the civic experience. So as we come into contact with communities and cultures that are different than us, art is one vehicle in which we can hope to understand each other better. W.E.B. Du Bois is an American civil rights activist, and he also was a prolific author that wrote, in this case, about art, and he says that beginning with art, because art tries to take us outside of ourselves, it's a matter of trying to create an atmosphere and context so conversation can flow back and forth, and we can be influenced by each other. As we talk about, Michael mentioned Glenn's talk about the participatory museum. This is in Melbourne. We'll have sessions on community engagement, and I think a lot of your museums are probably working towards this end. How can you experience diverse cultures inside of a museum setting, and how can the museum allow you to create a conversation that flows back and forth with each other? As we all grow and live closer and closer together, cheek by jowl, as we heard earlier, this is going to be an increasingly important opportunity for museums to seize upon. So as we do that, I'm optimistic that culture found in museums creates better citizens. There's a study at the University of Illinois in Chicago that looked at cultural participation linked to citizenship, and what they found was very interesting. They said even after controlling for things like age, race, and education, their study found that participation in the arts, especially as audience members, predicted civic engagement, tolerance, and altruism. So museums have the opportunity to positively influence our culture for the next 20, 30, 50 years. So, what happens, though, when we're reading a lot about the advances in technology? Of course, this is my background in automation and robotics and artificial intelligence. And maybe some of you are familiar, as this will show us here, that Audi debuted what was the world's fastest self-driving car. The Audi RS9 took the Hockenberg ring at over 150 miles an hour, completely without a driver. Google has been testing automated vehicles in California that are actually street legal now, and I don't know about you, but I'm not eager to meet one on the freeway. This creates an interesting problem and is going to be something we have to deal with in the next 30 years. So according to the US Census Bureau, the job occupation of truck drivers is the most common occupation for men in the United States. So truck drivers are coincidentally one of the lowest hanging fruits to replace with computer automation and self-driving vehicles. In fact, as we've seen in the last couple of recessions, there's a trend where jobs are declining, where those jobs are of a routine nature. And there was a study by Frey recently that looked at, of all the professions in the US, what's the probability that they would be replaced by computers? And so you can see on the right hand of the spectrum things like sales and service, office and administrative support are highly likely to be replaced by computer automation, while jobs in education, the arts and media, management, business, financial, and computers, of course, are less likely. So Frey and Osborne's study says, our findings thus imply that as technology races ahead, low-skill workers will reallocate their tasks that are non-susceptible to computerization, i.e., and here's the important part for museums, tasks requiring creative and social intelligence. So I think we'll see a change in the nature of work that will really impact the way in which museums can engage and connect with our society. First, automation is going to drive shorter work weeks in order to provide jobs for workers who had been displaced. In fact, we're already seeing this as a trend. The 4-day work week or the 3-day work week is beginning to be demonstrated to actually be more productive as a way to engage and work in your career. As these routine skills disappear, what we'll see is a need for creative class workers that will be a key point of concern for tomorrow's companies, and that shorter work weeks will result in more non-work hours. Of course, these are opportunities that museums can really take advantage of. The same study by Frey and Osborne said that for workers to win the race, however, they will have to acquire creative and social skills. So museums have an opportunity to teach that creativity and innovation in a way that is completely unique. We've collected creativity and innovation for centuries in ways that no other organization is able to do. A study in 2010 by IBM cited creativity as the single most crucial factor for success. So we surveyed 1,500 CEOs, and creativity was the thing that they were looking for in their future employees. Gerhard Leonhard writes on the future of knowledge, and he says that its future is to let the machines, this computer automation, do the heavy lifting on all the numbers, and for us humans to focus on connecting the dots, discovering context, meaning, and relevance, and making human sense of it all. So the computers can take the routine, but they'll never replace the sense-making that we bring to our professions. I think one of the things that's obvious to me is that curiosity and intellectual exploration is this sneak attack for museums. Museums have always been a place to meet each other. They've always been an escape, a space for inspiration. But one of the things that we see is that when curiosity is piqued in the museum, tremendous things happen as a result. We're learning an awful lot in the education sphere about intrinsic motivation to learn as the most effective way to acquire new skills. In fact, a study released just a couple of weeks ago in the beginning of October highlights the fact that creativity improves your ability to remember things. So if any of you are like me who have terrible memories, you need to be more curious. So this study suggests that once you light the fire of curiosity, the brain goes into a state that's more conducive to learning. Once you get this ramp up of dopamine, so when you're curious, your brain starts to produce a dopamine hit. Once you get the ramp up of dopamine, the brain becomes more like a sponge that's ready to soak up whatever is happening. In fact, their study shows that it's not only the things you're interested in that you remember better, but facts that you're not interested in when your brain has been exposed to curiosity. So this is what I call the sneak attack for museums. To end, I wanted to highlight a quote from an article by Wired recently that talks about how our world is really in a crucial spot to need to learn again how to discover. This article says, over the next 20 years, the Earth is predicted to add another 2 billion people. Having nearly exhausted nature's ability to feed the planet, we now need to discover new food system. The global climate will continue to change. To save our coastlines and maintain acceptable living conditions for more than 1 billion people, we need to discover new science, engineering, design, and architectural methods, and pioneer economic models that sustain their implementation and maintenance. Now here's the optimism part. The many rich and varied human cultures of the Earth will continue to mix more rapidly than they ever have through mass population movements and unprecedented information exchange. And to preserve social harmony, we need to discover new cultural referents, practices, and environments of cultural exchange. In such conditions, the future of law, medicine, philosophy, engineering, and agriculture, with just about every other field, are to be rediscovered. So it's my assertion, I leave you this morning with the fact that museums are keenly placed right in the center of being able to make this happen. So I would challenge you, and maybe some of your key takeaways are to think big and dream big about the ways in which your museum can change the world in your city, but also in cities that connect to each other. So thank you very much.